Instantly claiming central space, 1d4 opens diagonals for the queen and bishop while challenging black for dominance. Developing a knight toward the center, this flexible response prepares for various pawn structures and a potential kingside attack. Instantly staking a claim in the center, white builds pawn pressure while preparing piece development and eyeing the queenside. Establishing a solid pawn structure and preparing for kingside development, this move opens avenues for the bishop and queen. Developing a knight to its natural square here efficiently contests the center and prepares kingside castling. Developing the bishop here immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, creating diagonal tension and preparing for potential piece exchanges. Securing the pawn and preparing for central expansion, this offers a flexible approach, potentially rerouting the queen to support a kingside attack or maintain central pressure. Instantly challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust aims to liberate black's queenside and prepare for active piece play. Challenging black's bishop prompts a strategic decision, retreat or exchange, influencing the queenside pawn structure. Trading the bishop for the knight here relinquishes black's central control for a structural advantage, potentially opening lines for queenside play. Recapturing with the queen instantly restores material balance and opens up the d-file for potential future pressure. But it also awkwardly places the queen centrally, making it a target for black's developing pieces, potentially hindering white's queenside expansion. Re-establishing central influence, black sprints a knight to its natural square, aiming to bolster the pawn phalanx and prepare for development. This maneuver efficiently unifies the army, anticipating a potential push or defensive consolidation. Developing the kingside knight to its natural outpost now offers white active piece play. Seeking to exploit the slightly awkward pawn structure, black is developing into and potentially creating pressure on the queenside where white has a pawn majority. Aggressively challenging the queen's central influence, this knight surge aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially establish a strong outpost, though it opens lines for white's bishops and forces immediate attention. Aggressively confronting black's knight on e4, white aims to disrupt their attacking formation and gain a pawn majority on the queenside by forcing exchanges. Striking out at the queenside, black immediately challenges the intimidating queen and aims to disrupt white's control of the a5-e1 diagonal, potentially setting up future pressure on the b3 square. Forcing the black knight back with a tempo opens up lines and creates immediate questions about piece activity. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while simultaneously creating a flexible defense against white's aggressive queen placement is the primary objective here. This pawn advance, despite its seemingly passive nature, actually supports the knight's strong central outpost and prepares for potential pawn breaks later in the game. It discourages further immediate queenside expansion from white and buys valuable time for piece development. Clearing the center opens critical lines, allowing white to pressure black's queenside structure and eye the vulnerable d5 pawn. The exchange disrupts black's central pawn majority, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. This aggressive pawn removal signals white's intention to seize the initiative and dictate the pace of the game, forcing black to react to tactical threats. Opening the d-file grants immediate central influence, but be mindful of the potential for subsequent pawn weaknesses on the queenside should white continue to target that area. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing to castle kingside, this move aims to improve piece coordination and secure the king, while also subtly restricting black's knight on a5 from re-entering play effectively. Unleashing the bishop to f5 immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's queenside coordination, particularly eyeing the vulnerable a4 square. This bishop development adds pressure to the c2-g6 diagonal and prepares for potential pawn pushes like c5 or e5 to gain more central space. It's a proactive step to activate black's pieces and exploit any slight hesitations in white's pawn formation. Bringing the bishop to the diagonal opens a clear line for it to eye black's queenside, potentially supporting an advance on that wing or even creating threats against the king should the center open up. Unleashing the queen to b6 immediately exerts pressure on white's queenside pawn structure and hints at a potential queen maneuver towards the king. Strategic insight. Asterisk, this move is less about direct material gain and more about subtly altering the positional landscape. Black is signaling their readiness to engage in a more dynamic phase of the game, forcing white to consider awkward defenses or creative counterplay. The queen on b6 now eyes the c3 pawn, a key defender, and potentially the b2 square, creating a lurking threat. It also opens up the diagonal for the bishop on f5, which now has an unobstructed view of white's king and central squares. This is a proactive maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's development and create imbalances. Recentering the queen to the c2 square initiates a fascinating interplay of queen activity and defensive repositioning, simultaneously reinforcing the e4 outpost and preparing for potential pawn advances on the queen side, while also subtly challenging black's knight on a5. Unleashing a knight to the outpost at b3 creates immediate pressure on white's queenside pawn structure and opens up fascinating tactical possibilities. This aggressive maneuver disrupts white's developing harmony, forcing them to react rather than continue their own plans. Observe how the black knight now eyes both the crucial c-squares and potentially the b2 pawn, demanding white's immediate attention and possibly leading to a weakening of their defensive setup. A robust defensive maneuver. This rook retreat shores up the king's safety and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queen side, creating a solid wall against black's aggressive knight. Black boldly challenges the center, creating a dynamic imbalance by injecting a pawn into white's d4 stronghold. This pawn advance, while potentially weakening the queen side, immediately ignites a tactical skirmish and demands white's full attention, potentially diverting their focus from any intended queenside expansion or kingside attack. Injecting a knight to the queenside wing, white seeks to dislodge black's potent queenside blockade and create attacking avenues through that less defended territory. Unpinning the knight from the g2 pawn and freeing the d-file for potential counterplay, this maneuver repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the queenside and offering improved coordination with its comrades. The king now finds a more secure haven, escaping the immediate diagonal threats and opening avenues for rooks to become active participants. A daring rook maneuver emerges, contesting the critical c-file and preparing to inject dynamism into black's position, hinting at a potential kingside expansion or perhaps even a surprise pawn storm. Liberating the c-file for a potential invasion, white sacrifices the bishop to disrupt black's queenside harmony and potentially target the isolated d5 pawn, all while creating a central pawn majority that could become a potent force later. Initiating a pawn thrust to disrupt white's central control, this push fundamentally alters the pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines for your pieces. The immediate consequence is the creation of isolated pawns for white, a positional weakness that can be exploited later. By forcing the exchange, you're also taking initiative and challenging white's slightly awkward bishop placement on d3. This move signals a willingness to enter a more dynamic, possibly tactical phase of the game, where precise calculation and active piece play will be paramount. Observe how this pawn fight influences the mobility of your knights and the potential for future pawn breaks on the king side. Reclaiming central presence with the queen allows white to contest the d-file and aims to disrupt black's developing harmony. Challenging the center immediately reopens lines and forces white to make a decision about piece placement, potentially disrupting their pawn structure further and offering counterplay. The queen's repositioning aims to secure the central pawn structure and prepare for a more active role, potentially eyeing weaknesses on the king side or facilitating pawn advances. With the king finally tucked away, black initiates a more dynamic phase, aiming to exploit the open central files and potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure, particularly after white's recent exchange sacrifice, which has left their king a bit exposed. Reshaping the pawn structure with x4 fundamentally alters the piece dynamics, opening the e-file for potential rook activity, and creating a dynamic central tension where black's knight on a5 now looks less impressive. Rethinking pawn structure and unleashing the rook down the e-file is the core idea, aiming to exploit white's slightly passive piece placement and open up lines towards the enemy king. Unlocking the d-file with this pawn thrust immediately confronts black's pinned knight and intensifies the central pressure, potentially creating long-term weaknesses in black's pawn structure should the knight be forced to move awkwardly. A sensible repositioning, the bishop retreats to a more passive square, aiming to support the pawn chain and potentially reroute to a more active diagonal should circumstances permit, while also guarding against immediate threats. Reclaiming the central square after the pawn exchange, the queen repositions itself to influence the critical d5 pawn and I potential advancements, while also preparing to support a future e4 push if the opportunity arises. The queen retreats, seeking a more active post on the queen side, and simultaneously clears the b-file, which could become significant should the rook find its way there. A surprising tactical retreat, shifting the queen away from an active but potentially exposed central square to a more secure position, aiming to regroup forces and assess the dynamic tension arising from black's active piece play. Seeking active counterplay, black repositions their queen to target the d5 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses. A strategic repositioning, b3 aims to activate the bishop, eyeing the king side and offering potential support for future pawn advances while simultaneously solidifying the center's control. This reassignment of the rook to the 5th rank immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the e-file, adding considerable dynamic pressure to white's position while also creating potential weaknesses for white to exploit if black isn't careful. Bolstering the kingside pawn structure often anticipates future attacking sorties or strengthens defense against encroaching enemy pieces, a pragmatic consideration for white's monarch here given the open nature of the game. This piece repositions for an assertive presence on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. Pushing the f-pawn opens a precarious diagonal for the king, and more importantly, releases the pinned knight on g1, but at what cost? Suddenly, your monarch feels quite exposed, a tempting target now that the g-file is partially cleared. This tactical gamble might aim to disrupt black's bishop pair or exploit a perceived weakness, but it simultaneously creates a potent target for black's active pieces, particularly the queen and bishop. Consider the potential for discovered attacks or swift pawn advances against your weakened king's flank, a very real danger. Unleashing the bishop to h3, a bold sortie aimed at disrupting white's nascent attacking formation and potentially forcing a concession in the pawn structure. This aggressive placement not only eyes the kingside, but also potentially opens lines for black's rooks and queen to become more active. It's a move that demands white's immediate attention, as leaving it unchecked could lead to a dangerous invasion or significant material imbalances. Reinstating a rook to the central open file aims to disrupt black's seemingly solid pawn structure and activate white's underutilized pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black aggressively pushes the g-pawn, aiming to rip open lines for their pieces and potentially expose white's monarch. This bold advance injects immediate tension, forcing white to consider how to react to this pawn's forward surge. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white aggressively seeks to fracture black's carefully constructed kingside defense and exploit the open g-file, daring black to capture and initiate a sharp tactical sequence. Seizing the initiative, black gambles on disrupting white's seemingly solid pawn structure. This audacious pawn sacrifice on d5 throws a wrench into white's carefully constructed defensive setup, aiming to unlock critical diagonals and open lines for black's pieces. The immediate consequence is a potential cascading attack, forcing white to address the newly created imbalances. Consider how this move forces white's pieces to become less coordinated as they react defensively, potentially sacrificing tempi and positional advantage in the process. The king, though still centrally located, may soon find itself under indirect pressure as black's rooks awaken. Unleashing the queen to this active square immediately puts pressure on black's d4 pawn and potentially opens lines towards the kingside, forcing black to react and consider defenses beyond simply consolidating their material advantage. Unleashing a tactical whirlwind, black sacrifices a pawn, aiming to shatter white's pawn structure and expose the king. This aggressive gambit disrupts white's intended development, seeking to gain initiative and create weaknesses around the king's defenses. The immediate aftermath will likely see white forced to defend, potentially leading to a more open and dynamic game where black's active pieces can exploit the created chaos. The key will be whether black can coordinate their remaining pieces effectively to capitalize on this bold sacrifice. Unleashing a positional gamble, white sacrifices pawn territory to dismantle black's advancing kingside attack and create immediate pressure on the open g-file, potentially exposing the black monarch. Unleashing a knight's daring raid, black's move dramatically recenters the action around white's king. This aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt white's defensive structure, forcing a reaction and potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn's shield protecting the monarch. The knight's newfound central presence threatens immediate complications, potentially forking pieces or establishing a strong outpost. A calculated decision to trade off black's active bishop, aiming to neutralize the immediate tactical threat and simplify the position, though it grants black the open g-file. The knight's journey to d2, a remarkable feat of maneuvering, disrupts white's pawn structure and opens a dangerous path towards the king. The capture of the pawn opens up the kingside, creating immediate threats. A bold queen sacrifice is initiated, aiming to disrupt white's central structure and potentially open lines towards the king. The monarch's vulnerability is now glaringly exposed, a testament to black's aggressive pawn storm and the open diagonal pointing directly at the king. The rook's audacious leap to c2 boldly threatens the second rank, forcing white to reconsider the safety of their monarch amidst the unfolding chaos and potentially opening avenues for further infiltration. Unleashing the queen to survey potential threats and opportunities across the board, this repositioning aims to exploit the exposed enemy king and the open files now available for offensive maneuvering. King's safety dramatically plummets as black forces a check that unravels white's position, exposing the monarch to a cascade of threats that will soon dominate the board.